Welcome to Unaborted, part 3 episode of our long-form conversation with Claire Chambers and Audrey Werner. We are going to talk about how Kinsey's bunk social science on sex actually became used as the follow the science, academic, credible proof that actually then becomes used to bolster the agenda to change those Judeo-Christian laws that protected the family, marriage, and children. If Hugh Hefner was the bridge between Kinsey and culture, then in this next episode, we're going to talk about how Kinsey social science also gets bridged into law through the American Law Institute and their assault on Judeo-Christian laws specifically designed to protect the family. Guys, ideas have consequences and bad ideas have victims. I'm Seth Gruber, and this is Unaborted. Talk more about how far that rabbit hole goes down.
Yes.
With how those ideas and science about the sexuality of children actually had major familial and child consequences for how rape and pedophilia was treated. Can you build that out for our listeners?
Well, and when we look at the authors of the Model Penal Code, they were law professors, one from Columbia University, Morris Plaskow, who was a New York magistrate and attorney, he stated most so-called statutory rape cases involve situations in which a male has had sexual intercourse with a consenting young female. We would have preferred to have even lowered the limit for the new age of consent, which became, that's the thing, when Kinsey's science came in and they were changing the laws, they lowered the age of consent. So it would have been adulthood. Now it was lowered to 16 or 15. And then he said, in our opinion, a girl at puberty, now think about when girls go into puberty, fully understands what she's doing when she engages in the act of sexual intercourse. And the fiction of non-consent, which the law sets up, doesn't correspond with the facts. And he was quoted as saying that in Sex Offenses in the New Penal Law, Brooklyn Law Review in 1966.
Wow.
So actually the Model Penal Code, when I looked it up, the history of the the American Law Institute Model Penal Code, which RSVP did a great summary of it from 1923 to 207. And in it, the Model Penal Code, they're now recommending, the American Law Institute is now recommending to lower the age of consent to 10 years old. Based on Kinsey.
Today.
But they're accepting that 12 can sometimes be a proper age of, of consent. This was in 2007.
Wow.
But what's interesting is, and I said this quote to you before on your one podcast, where they had all of these experts who had been trained, that were humanists, communists, that were trained in Kinsey science, who then were quoted in all of these law reviews to influence the lawmakers. And I said this quote before, the sometimes extreme seductiveness of a young female is a factor which has no place in the law, but it certainly affects motivation. Even at the age of 4 or 5, this seductiveness may be so powerful as to overwhelm the adult into committing the offense. The affair is not always the result of the adult's aggression. Often the young female is the initiator and the seducer. And that was from Ralph Silvanko and Phillips, Psychosexuality and the Criminal Law in Vanderbilt Law Review. So in 1962.
62,
so,
wow.
But what was interesting, because I knew this because my attorney general has not signed out. Model penal. Okay, so now they have, there's a new Model Penal Code revision that's out. And as of last year, and I just looked it up. You can Google it. But so far, 36 state attorney generals have rejected it because it is loosening penalties against the perpetrator. Mm-hmm. Because they're still pushing Kinsey's science.
Yeah.
The ultimate goal is to remove All laws.
That's
So
right.
anything goes. So
So-
if an adult wants to have sex with an infant down the road,
Guys, the slippery slope conservatives
Yes.
have always been right.
Yes.
That's what Audrey is trying to tell you.
Yes.
Claire was called a conspiracy theorist and a tin hat wearing weirdo in the 70s. We're being called that today.
Yes.
The conservatives were called that when they said, hey, if you encourage sexual chaos and adultery, you're eventually going to get rid of no-fault divorce laws. And the conservatives were told that they were conspiracy theorists, slippery slope.
Victorian.
Yeah, exactly. What happened?
Yes.
No-fault divorce laws. And then conservatives said, if you continue down this road, you're eventually going to call for the redefinition of marriage.
Yes.
And oh my gosh, we were laughed, we were mocked,
Yes.
we were reviled. Obergefell.
Yes.
And then conservatives were saying, actually, even before Obergefell, the true Ezekiels who were watchmen who understand these ideas were warning even before Obergefell
Right.
that the route that the modern left is trying to take you is to pedophilia and to adult-child relationships. That as long as there's consent,
yes.
then there's nothing wrong between relationships between children and adults, and maybe even incest, which actually shouldn't surprise us, given that a later executive director of the Kinsey Institute is named Wardell Pomeroy. And Wardell Pomeroy told Time Magazine in a 1980 interview called Attacking the Last Taboo. He said, incest between children and adults can sometimes be beneficial. And it need not be a sign of mental illness. I was like, whoa. And he was a researcher for Kinsey. And he was a board member for SIECUS.
Yes.
And he later took on the role of executive director at the Kinsey
Can
Institute.
I also interject, though, Seth?
Another quote by
Can I interject the fact that, remember what I said about Morris Plesko, that knowledge is, that he's talking about knowledge, that if a young girl has the knowledge is consent, right? In medicine, we have to, educate you on the procedure you're about to get and the risks that are involved. We give you that knowledge, and then you either consent to it or you don't. SIECUS, sex education. What are we doing? We're giving children knowledge at 5 years old on sex. And if we've given them knowledge, then that's consent. Then they can consent to this act. And that's why one of the laws that was brought in was called, because it's against the law to show obscenity to children.
Yeah.
But in 43 states, it's legal.
That's what I was going to ask you next.
If you show it in schools or in libraries. You can show porn to children, and that is legal.
Yep.
And that's why you have all these parents now who are just finding it.
Yeah.
But it's been there
For a long time.
for a long time. But parents, I think because of COVID and being home, and
started
parents
learning,
are starting to wake up to this issue.
Yeah. Now, as we continue to frame the timbers before we turn back to you, Claire, and discuss a little bit about this guy named Lester Kirkendall, because we don't have time to discuss all of the revolutionaries that were tied up with SIECUS, but if we were to focus on one or two, he would be one of them. But before we turn to him, Claire, Audrey, I think it's important to understand how intertwined so many of the revolutionaries were.
Yes.
Sometimes even down to the family level.
Yes.
So Alan Guttmacher was the president of Planned Parenthood before Roe came down, so in the 60s, but he was also the president of Planned Parenthood in 73 when we get Roe v. Wade.
Yes.
And he's the namesake of the Guttmacher Institute, which is Planned Parenthood's statistical research branch.
Right.
Now, Alan Guttmacher had a brother.
A twin brother.
Can you connect that piece in regards to the footwork or legwork being done with the model penal code?
Well,
which again, to remind everyone who's listening, the whole goal was to remove dozens of Bible-based laws that were specifically structured and passed to provide protections for children, family, and marriages.
Yes. And his twin brother was Manfred Guttmacher, and he was a psychiatrist, and he happened to be one of the advisors to the model penal code. So he had input
to the American Law Institute.
Yes, wow. They used him as an advisor to draft the model penal code. So you have Alan and his brother. I mean, it's like we were talking about the Huxleys. That Julius.
Oh yes, we'll talk. We didn't talk about the Aldous Huxley link yet.
And Aldous.
Can you guys talk about that?
Well, Aldous wrote Brave New World in 1923. And somebody said, a parent said to me, where do you, like where we are today, where do you see this going? I said, read Brave New World.
That's right.
Because
and
that
1984.
Was, Brave.
The leftists actually, the leftists actually have a decision to make.
Yes.
At this moment in the culture where they have to decide whether they're going Aldous Huxley route or George Orwell.
Yes.
They have a decision to make. We're kind of at a fork in the road right now.
And that was their vision. That was their eugenic vision. Were those books. And Aldous and Julius were grandfather to the father of the agnostic movement, which I am spacing his name right now. But so again, the fruit of the tree and these demonic fruits that are coming from that. So yeah, and
Julian Huxley, who we said earlier, lays much of the groundwork with G. Brock Chisholm, who you referred to, Claire, as the director.
He was the head of the UNESCO, which was the educational arm of the UN.
Yes,
so,
he was the Director General of the United Nations Ethical Society Cultural Organization, UNESCO, who sponsored that symposium on sex ed. That the Swedish delegates brought the blueprint for what Mary Calderon would build CICUS off of. Are you guys seeing the timbers yet?
Yes. Well, and I want to. I'm going to end with this and then go back to you.
I'm not in a hurry. I'm being educated too.
This was a Kinseyan follower who was Iris Reese, and he was the author of An End to Shame, was the name of his book.
Right, of course.
And he was, by the way, the president of CICUS at one point. And he said, to build sexual pluralism, we must firmly root out the narrow thinking about sex that exists in our basic institution: family, political, economic, religious, and educational. We need to change our whole basic social institutional structure. We don't need a majority of the nation in order to make significant changes in our society. We need only a small percentage of the population who are dedicated to promoting all of our sexual rights.
Yep.
So a small group of people have shifted our nation.
Is all it's ever taken.
Yes.
Yeah. And the same is true on the other side of the aisle. If conservatives and godly men and women
take a stand.
have the committed minority.
Exactly.
Now, before we turn to this individual named Lester Kirkendall, who's kind of one of the keys, I think, or puzzle pieces to understanding the timbers of the House, help us understand the obscenity exemption laws, because this was one of the great victories of the left's long walk through the institutions. It was a way to prevent concerned citizens from even exercising their political will to stop some of the pornographic sex ed in the schools.
Yes.
What are our obscenity exemptions? Because we have obscenity laws in America still, many of them on the books that aren't enforced.
Exactly. But if you're using, for example, the book you have
which we're about to turn to.
Yes. If you're using porn, and there are cited examples of now, I'm hearing of teachers that are showing porn in the classroom, and they would normally be arrested if they were your next door neighbor, but because they're an educator,
that's right,
and they're doing it in a school setting and they're doing it for educational purposes,
that's right,
they're allowed to do that. And so there is a small group of parents and experts who are going after these obscenity laws. And I feel
obscenity exemption laws,
yes. And I feel honored because Texas was the first state to have gone after it a few years back. Was not successful. And then
you and Monica Klein were working
and
on
then yes, there were four of us. I say four moms that went before the committee, and we got it passed out of the committee, but it never made it to the floor for a vote. But because nobody knows that. Nobody knows that porn is legal. Obscenity, it is legal to show children obscenity in the classroom.
This is legalized child abuse.
Exactly.
Yes, it is.
Exactly. And think about the child who's been traumatized already by sex abuse, and you're putting this in front of them.
That's right.
You're also re-traumatizing them as well. So, and Indiana went after it, and so I got to be there to testify for that. And one of the former attorney generals got up, and what was funny was we sent them. We went into the parents in Indiana went into the schools, and I will tell you, Seth, there are parents parents all over this country that are going into their children's libraries and going into public libraries and having to read the most pornographic, awful
and
descriptions.
Sometimes when they take it to the school board meeting and they read it to the school board, they turn their mic off and they say that's inappropriate.
Yes.
You just proved the whole point. That's why they're reading it to say it's inappropriate.
When we were testifying before the Indiana Senate committee about this,
it's called gaslighting.
Yes. We gave them the parents of Indiana had put together a packet with excerpts from the books and from what schools all over the state. And so I read this and I'm like, whoa, this is even worse than what I thought, and gave those packets to the senators. Their aides came out before the testimony. They came out and said, okay, we read the packet. Wow, that's a lot of information. We know you guys probably won't do this, but please don't read this aloud during the proceedings because this is being televised and classrooms of children will be watching this.
Yeah.
And
you can't make this stuff up.
Yeah, Aaron Negagard, who had been the former attorney general in Indiana, he said, if you can't as adults read this, why are we giving this to children as homework? You know, so it's just ludicrous where we're at.
Because they want your children.
Yes.
May I add a little excerpt to this?
Please, Clark.
Years ago when we went before our State Board of Education, we took Zing Sex Comics by Saul Gordon.
Oh,
it's
yes.
in there. I did not my story today, but he's in there. And he was such a sex pervert you can't imagine, and he admitted it. But we took them to show the state board. We were not permitted to do that.
Yeah.
They didn't even want to see it.
Yeah.
Because they already knew about him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
See,
he had served on a committee statewide.
Yeah.
He had already, they knew who he was.
Yeah.
Well, but the whole point, right, of your book here, Claire, and our conversation is that this has been brewing under the surface for a long time.
Yes.
We've been professionalizing pedophiles.
Yes.
That's what we've been doing.
Yes. Normalizing.
Yes.
Yeah. And the power of normalization is something that can never be overstated. That if you do the wrong thing once, and you can fail to stand up against evil. It just gets normalized in the culture because culture is to us what water is to a fish. It's all we know.
Yes.
And so if you can normalize things in the culture for long enough, the people just become numb to it.
Yeah.
And that's actually really dangerous for a republic.
Yes.
Is that when people who would otherwise not agree with the targeting of children, the sexualizing of children, become so accustomed to that as part of their culture, that's one of the last straws of a civilization.
Well, parents are the barrier.
Yeah.
And Planned Parenthood has even said that.
Yeah.
That parents are the barrier to services for children.
Yeah.
And so I will say that as Kinsey's science has been used, and a lot of parents are like, well, I homeschool, so this doesn't affect me. Or I have older people that, oh, well, thank goodness I don't have any grandchildren, so I don't have to worry about this. Lest I remind you, this is because what happened is the family fell apart. As the sexual revolution went forward, and Kinsey said there would be long, successful marriages, we saw single parenting explode when sex ed SICA started up in 1964. We have the national statistics show teen STDs and pregnancy rate exploded, and the single parent families exploded. So now we have to have family courts to help decide who's going to get the kids, because there's all these families that are falling apart. So now we have a handbook that's called the Principles of the Family Law of the Law of Family Dissolution. And in the beginning, it says the changes, this was written in 2002, the changes in terminology cannot be expected by themselves to revolutionize how custody allegations are viewed, but they may contribute to a broader reconceptualization of the enterprise. So we're not calling families families anymore, they're enterprises, from who will possess and control children to what adjustments in family roles will be most appropriate for the child. It affirms that the options are not limited to one or two prescribed models, but rather are spread out along a continuum. And they even say parents can be relied upon to have a gender and race biases. So courts must intervene in a family on child's behalf to determine the child's best interest. And we're seeing that where schools are training children up in the trans issues, and then the schools are actually stepping in and fighting for custody of the child because they want to continue to transition them. And here's where Kinsey comes in. Some courts assume that the open homosexuality of a parent is detrimental to the child's interest. This treatment reflects moral judgment, not a scientific one, and even as a moral matter is subject to considerable debate. So whose science are they using? They're using Kinsey's science.
Yeah.
So it's not even true science that they're using. And we have the science of studying the American family for the last 70 years. Yeah. What's happened to it since we've done the sexual revolution, since Seekis came out?
Yeah.
So
we quoted Lester Kirkendall earlier, who said in that Seekis Study Guide #1 in 1969 that children are sexual from birth. And can actually exercise sexual pleasure, right? So this is straight out of Kinsey. This is demonic stuff. This is professionalizing pedophiles. But Lester Kirkendall, maybe Claire, appears to be one of the more significant individuals involved in the humanist experiment, part of the American Humanist Association, a board member of Seekis, very involved. Founding member of Seekis with Mary Calderon.
Six founders, he was one of them.
Yeah. And you quoted him making a fascinating admission. And I wanted to ask you both about this. And then I think you brought some of Lester Kirkendall's writings with us today, which I want you to kind of build out as you address this man. But you quoted him admitting something that we all kind of know to be true, but the left will never say out loud. Kirkendall explained actually that the population agenda movement, the population reduction movement, right? Too many people on planet Earth, it actually required the sex ed movement. That you actually had to have Seekis style sex ed if you were going to usher in a one world government to be able to deal with the scientifically proven threat of overpopulation. And here's what you cite and quote Lester Kirkendall as saying. He said, effective contraceptive methods and in the long run population control were closely linked with physiological knowledge about sex, a capacity for free discussion and attitudes towards sex roles and sex itself. Sex education, says Kirkendall, is thus clearly tied in a socially significant way to family planning and population limitation policy. And today, Seekis's new name is Seekis Sex Ed for Social Change. Well, we have to ask ourselves the question, what kind of social change are they actually seeking? Let me add one more thing here, Claire. Mary Calderon, founder of Seekis, once said, mere discussion of facts is not enough. It must be undergirded by a set of values, end quote. She's talking about sex ed. She's saying you can't just talk about facts. That conversation with children has to be undergirded by a set of values. Whose values? What social change? Whose religion? Right? The religion of humanism, which is kind of the thesis of your entire book. So let's talk about Lester Kirkendall. Let's talk about how sex ed needs to be used to bring about population limitation.
Yes. Well, a little bit of background on him. First of all, he represented actual family life education at the founding of Seekis because he already taught family life education in Oregon at the State University. So I believe it was called the State University. Now, Who's Who described Lester Kirkendall as a Unitarian. He listed himself as a Baptist when he was asked.
You actually made the point in your book that much of the American Humanist Association movement was actually birthed out of the Unitarians.
Yes.
Which was interesting.
Yes, it was. It was. And actually, Unitarianism, as I see it, is sort of a stepping stone to atheism. That's the way I view it.
Yeah.
you just become very open.
Well, they're universalists.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So anyway, the way he was described, it's especially confusing because in 1966 he assumed directorship of the Atheistic American Humanist Association.
Wow.
And that was 2 years after Sikhis's founding.
That's right. He became the director.
Yes. And of course, they're dedicated to the eradication of God.
That's right.
Yes.
Let's say that again. The American Humanist Association is dedicated to the eradication of God.
Absolutely.
God, or rather, God doesn't exist, and I really hate him.
Exactly.
Which is very strange.
And for now, I think it would be good for, I meant to say this earlier, that your listeners should equate humanism just with atheism.
Yeah.
It's easier for now to just picture that when we talk about humanism. Now, at the same time, he also served as editor of Sexology magazine, which has been described as very lewd and obscene.
Yes.
I used to have copies of it. I no longer do. He authored, this is good too. He authored Premarital Intercourse and Interpersonal Relations. It's a book, and it became notorious for containing case histories of 668 premarital intercourse experiences presented in living color involving 200 college-level males.
Wow.
Again, a Kinsey type thing.
Yeah.
Okay. But he's probably best known to us for having authored this book called A New Bill for Sexual Rights and Responsibilities, published in 1976. And I don't believe I'm allowed to show this.
Obscenity.
Yes, the pictures that are in here.
Let's just put you in a public high school.
Yes, if you're in a school or a library, we can show this.
Absolutely. Maybe I'll try that sometime.
You can describe what's in this.
What's in this book? Yes, many humanists have signed it, by the way, including seven Sikhs board of members or board of directors.
Wow.
And it either condones or endorses abortion, extramarital sex, premarital sex, homosexuality, bisexuality, pornography, sex among or with children, free sex for criminals. Kinsey had to take care of the criminals there.
Right.
And mentally handicapped. In other words, I think they have that now, don't they, for criminals? You can have sex if you want with your wife.
Conjugal visits.
But
yes.
I'm sure now it doesn't have to be a wife. And the legalization of prostitution, sadomasochism, masturbation, and the right to birth control. And last but not least, comprehensive sex education.
Yep, there it is. Signed by many of the leading humanists and revolutionaries, including people like John Money.
Yes.
John Money, for those of the people listening who don't know, is the first architect at the attempt of gender transition, gender mutilation surgeries. And so it refers to a young boy whose circumcision was botched. And so his family, with John Money, decided to just entirely castrate their newborn son, try to create kind of a, manufactured female parts and then raise him as a girl. Well, that man ended up killing himself, committing suicide as an adult. And when he found it out, his entire life just unraveled after that and understood why his life was always so horrible. And you even had, and I'm forgetting the name of the person who first opened up a full-blown gender transition clinic at Johns Hopkins University. I'm forgetting the name of the individual right now. But he shut it down because he was saying that this is not helping
John Hopkins shut it down.
Anyone at all.
So that's
John Money who's signing this, guys. and many other of some of these revolutionaries. You've got Ira Reese here, who would later lead Seekus, who you just referred to. Paul Kurtz, who was the editor-in-chief of the Humanist. Albert Ellis, interesting. You cite him at length in your book.
The Institute for Rational Living.
Yes. Whatever.
Group.
Yeah. And Brigitta Linner, a marriage counselor and co-author of Sex and Society in Sweden.
Yes.
Who actually, I believe, reported on some of the gathering of the UNESCO-sponsored symposium on sex education and health education. Right. And Alan Bell of the Institute for Sex Research at Indiana University, later renamed the Kinsey Institute. So there it is, guys. I doubt you'll find this anywhere. But that's who Lester Kirkendall was. And he's openly admitting that the goal is a one world government. The goal is actually population control. And so it's you say that today and you'll be labeled a conspiracy theorist, Claire and Audrey, right? And yet you've got one of the most significant individuals spawned out of the sexual revolution, Lester Kirkendall, openly admitting this. And so why is this? Because population control is best achieved if people do it willingly. The way you get them to do it willingly is to encourage radical sexual chaos and pump everyone full of birth control and puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones today. Because they'll be easier to control and they'll be limiting their own population volitionally. They'll be choosing it themselves. Right. Because birth control assumes more liberal ideas about sex. Right. And those more liberal ideas about sex are planted in the early minds of young people through sex ed. That's why it's linked directly to population limitation, which is one of the most common shared goals of so many of the revolutionaries that you talk about that were designing these humanist organizations.
Yeah. And once again, Saul Gordon of Zing Sex Comics signed this. So that, should make you feel confident.
Very briefly, as we start winding down a little bit here, Claire, let's talk about just some of the communist links. You were talking with me off air about Joseph Fletcher, who we've already touched on as the father of situation ethics. Talk about some of his communist links, because this actually starts to become a very common denominator, doesn't it, of many of the people you talk about in this book, even if the founders and board members of Seekus weren't actual outed communists. Almost all of them were involved and had links to communist front organizations. And so you start to wonder, okay, what is the common denominator here? Because Hitler would say things like, I don't care if you oppose me. I've got your children in my schools. Right. This is like this goal of reaching children, of radicalizing them at an early age. It's sexualizing them at an early age, is a creed and common observation of communist societies. Because if you can get the kids while they're young, they'll serve you forever. And if they're educated in echo chambers where they only hear one side of things, then they'll be that much easier to control. And if you can sexualize them when they're young, and break down their moral inhibitions and systems of values that should be being inculcated by the family, then they'll be even easier to control. Because when you encourage sin and chaos, it creates docile citizens who cannot govern themselves. So anyways, all that to say, it's interesting how many communists were behind so much of the sexual revolution and the push for the radical sex ed.
If your listeners will forgive me, I can't find the quote. I have it with me, so I'm just going to try to paraphrase. But Joseph Fletcher was identified, in fact, by Harry Ward, an undercover investigator for the FBI at the time. And he went on to, he actually testified, that is Herbert Philbrick, that he, as an undercover agent, joined the Communist Party and actually worked with Joseph Fletcher.
Interesting.
And Joseph
you did
Fletcher,
say that in your book.
And Joseph Fletcher was a reverend and from the Union Theological Society, which has always been very leftist. So that was him. Now, we mentioned Harriet Pilpul, and I think if we get back to her, that'll be fine. But we want to finish the thought about the communist people. Remember, she worked with she was an actual authority with the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union.
So for people who missed it, you're talking about Harriet Pilpul.
Yes.
She was a lawyer, came out of the ACLU.
Yes.
And again, a pal of Sekas, a pal of Lester Kirkendall.
Yes.
Right. I just paused you so people heard the name you said.
Okay.
And another architect, right, of this stuff.
Yes, but she, having been very high up with the ACLU, it's interesting that a former undercover operative by the name of David Gumar stated 4 years after Sekas was founded in 1969, he said, and she was still with them, the present ACLU board consists of 68 members, 31 of whom have succeeded in amassing a total of at least 355 Communist Front citations. That's the group that she was with.
Wow.
Now, while she served Sekas as their general counsel, she was also, you'll like this one, a member and leader of the Association for the Study of Abortion, the Association for the Voluntary Sterilization of People, and Planned Parenthood, of course. So I wanted to point that out.
And you make the point, actually, here in your book, Claire, that Harriet Pilpul, a Sekas official, was also involved with the ethical movement, the American Ethical Union, which many people, I was not aware of this at all. And so let me just tell people, Claire brilliantly tracks here the early harbingers of humanism, that the American Humanist Association was not like, it's not like they came fully onto the scene out of nowhere.
Right.
There were lots of seeds that were already growing in the American soil, such that an organization like the American Humanist Association or the first Humanist Manifesto could come onto the scene at all.
Exactly.
And you trace that as these American ethical cultural societies, later birthed in the name Society for Ethical Culture or American Ethical Union,
which was
by Felix Adler. Yes,
the American Ethical Union was international.
That's right. There was a national body and an international body.
Exactly.
And so it's interesting when we start to frame these timbers once again, we start to find it impossible to believe that the individuals framing the house were not talking with one another. We find it impossible to believe that they were not functioning off of a common blueprint that was struck up before any building was begun. And so Harriet Pilpul, who with the Greenbaum, Wolf, and Ernst legal team helped draft the Articles of Incorporation for Sekas.
Yes.
And yet, wait for this, Harriet Pilpul is also involved in the ethical movement. The American Ethical Union was a member of the American Ethical Union's Board of Ethical Lecturers Advisory Committee. And you cite a November-December 1964 issue of Ethical Culture Today reporting, quote, the Office of Greenbaum, Wolf, and Ernst provides legal counsel for the American Ethical Union, the first group of out-and-out humanist organizations before the officially recognized humanist movement and the American Humanist Association.
Exactly.
They were all talking to one another the entire time.
There are two others that were talking to each other, if you'd like to know.
Please.
Two founders of the ACLU. One was Harry F. Ward. He was an identified communist and the first ACLU chairman. William Z. Foster, who was the former head of the Communist Party in the United States, and in 1932, and I'm going to quote him in a minute, Foster called for a cabinet-level Department of Education, which we never had before, in his book called Toward a Soviet America. And this is what he said: the schools, colleges, and universities will be coordinated and grouped under a National Department of Education and its state and local branches. The studies will be revolutionized, being cleansed of religious, patriotic, and other features of the bourgeois, which is the middle class in lingo of the communists. The features of the bourgeois ideology. The students will be taught internationalism and the general ethics of the new socialist society.
Wow.
And she joined that group and was very active.
Wow.
What year was that? That
was in 1932.
Wow.
Yes.
It's almost like they had a plan the entire time.
Yes. Framing the timbers.
Yeah, that's right.
And also keep in mind that the almost 50%, if I didn't already say this, almost 50% of the Sikh study guides were written by Isidore Rubin, who had been identified as a communist. And the actual record of that testimony is in the appendix of my book.
Wow. Yes, and you're for anyone who finds this book, the appendix is full of additional very helpful information
and many, many references.
So you cite a editorial in the Humanist from 1968 called "Is World Government Dead?" And the Humanist writes in 1968, if there is one principle upon which all humanists are united, it is the continued commitment to a world order based upon world law. That's from the Humanist magazine in 1968, saying the one common denominator shared amongst all humanists is a one world government. So much so that in 1971, many leaders of the American Humanist Association, you cite here in your book, Claire, pulled out a full-page advertisement in the New York Times on July 27, 1971, calling for, quote, a world federal government to be open at all times to all nations without right of secession, with the power to curb overpopulation. One of the signers of that advertisement in 1971 in the New York Times was Paul Ehrlich. Paul Ehrlich sat on the board of Planned Parenthood. Paul Ehrlich is the author of the very infamous book, The Population Bomb, written in 1963 or 64, that repeated the claims of Thomas Malthus from the late 1700s and early 1800s that if the world population wasn't significantly reduced in the next few decades, you'd have massive starvation all around the world because there wouldn't be enough resources to handle the population growth. 30 years after Paul Ehrlich writes his book, The Population Bomb, the world population had doubled. Malnutrition was at an all-time low, and we were the fattest generation in American history. So once again, I don't think science means what they think it means. And yet this is how long they've been laboring at that. As we kind of wind down, guys, because we're short on time and we want to respect your time, let's, and of course, Claire, you interject at any time. Let's add this last piece. Let's talk about the occult.
Thank you guys so much for tuning in to this part 3 episode of our long form conversation with Claire Chambers and Audrey Werner. Incredible information. Let me ask you something. If you've been with us now for all 3 parts, how much of this did you know before tuning into this podcast? How many of your friends, family members, and coworkers do you think know any of this? My guess would be very little to none. So to cite Hosea 4:6 once again, the Bible might know what it's talking about when it says that God's people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. You can't defeat an enemy that you don't understand. And we're trying to help you understand not just the enemy, but their coordination and how long they've been fighting this battle against the church, against Christianity, against children, against the family, against marriages, against a healthy moral fabric. And so we've talked about how this fake science and sex ed was being used to upend and change laws, dozens of Bible-based laws in America that allowed for the Democrat Party to do what they're doing today, which is what? To lessen penalties and criminal consequences for pedophiles and rapists. Have you noticed how they're like very passionate about that? That goes back to the American Law Institute and their model penal code, and the twin of the Planned Parenthood president consulting with the American Law Institute and drafting the model penal code to change the laws in America. Do you understand why this is so significant? So if you're starting to now wonder, hey, Seth, this sounds just kind of like demon stuff. This is kind of sounds like a spiritual war. Yes, good. Now we have arrived at part 4, which is coming out next, where we're going to dive into the occult side of all of this. And there is a demonic nature to this battle, brothers and sisters, with the UN, with actual Satanists that Alfred Kinsey looked up to, whose sexual data he was trying to get. This rabbit hole is very disturbing, but we're going down it for you to start waking you up. By the way, isn't it interesting? What does Hugh Hefner use to represent Playboy? A rabbit, right? So yeah. Well, we need to expose those rabbits, these humping rabbits in the rabbit hole, and start exposing all of this. And so stay tuned for next week in the final edition of this 4-part series with Claire Chambers, a woman who knew it all in the 70s, and her protege, Audrey Werner, my dear friends, who are going to now explain to us the demonic occult side of all of this. And when someone tells you who they are, to quote Maya Angelou, you should believe them. And they're going to tell you who they are. Stay tuned for next week. I'm Seth Gruber, and this is Unaborted.